My brother wore a badge he never earned to his engagement party and told a room full of people a story about the instructor he quit in front of. He did not know I was standing 6 feet away, listening to him turn my name into his lie. The badge looked brand new. That was the first thing I noticed when I walked into my father's backyard. Not Caleb's suit. Not the string lights. Not the engagement banner Alyssa's family had hung between two cottonwoods at the edge of the patio. The badge. It sat on my brother's chest, polished, so clean it caught every warm bulb above him and threw the light back like it had something to prove. Caleb had positioned himself perfectly for it too. Left shoulder angled toward the patio. Chin up. One hand around a glass of bourbon he was not drinking. The other resting near Alyssa's lower back like a man already posing for the memory. He had always known how to use a room. My father stood beside him with his hand on Caleb's shoulder and his chest out, so far you would have thought the credential had been awarded to both of them. One of the most highly trained specialists in the military, Dad said to a cluster of Alyssa's relatives. They don't just hand those out. No. They do not. That was exactly the problem. I stood near the edge of the patio with a club soda in my hand, dark jeans, field boots, and a charcoal jacket that still had dust in the seams from the last training rotation. Nobody asked what I did when I arrived. Nobody ever did. My father had given me 3 words, a shoulder pat, and then turned back toward Caleb before I had fully stepped onto the patio. Nate, you made it. That was the greeting. Caleb got both arms. Caleb got pride. Caleb got an audience. I got carbonation in a plastic cup and a view of a badge that had never spent a night pressed against wet ground while the cold tried to talk a man out of finishing what he started. A real badge carries history. Not dirt exactly, though sometimes dirt. More than that. Wear. Pressure. The small scratches that come from buckles, rifles, rucks, walls, and weather. The dulling that happens when metal stops being decoration and becomes evidence. Caleb's badge had none of that. It looked like it had been taken from a case that afternoon. I took a sip of club soda. Then I looked at my brother smiling under the string lights. And I knew he was lying. My name is Nathan Pierce. Most people call me Nate. I am 36 years old, and I have been in the Army for 14 years. At the time of Caleb's engagement party, I was a master sergeant and a senior marksmanship instructor, which is a title my family had heard before and somehow translated into something involving storage rooms, supply forms, and inventory counts. I stopped correcting them years ago. Correction requires a listener. My work was not glamorous in the way civilians understand glamour. It did not photograph well at dinner parties. It did not come with easy stories people could repeat over drinks without losing the parts that mattered. It was math. Weather. Breath. Discipline. Stillness. It was knowing what a man would do when his body wanted comfort and the course offered none. It was seeing whether confidence survived exhaustion, cold, silence, and the slow private conversation every candidate eventually has with quitting. That is why the badge bothered me. Not because Caleb wore it. Because of the way he wore it. Clean. Bright. Hungry for light. A real badge is not supposed to look like a prop. It is supposed to look like it has been carried through places where performance stops being useful. Mud. Night. Frozen ground. Wet sleeves. Rucks dropped too hard against concrete. The edge of a rifle scraping metal when nobody has the energy left to care about keeping anything pretty. A real credential does not mean you looked good under string lights. It means you stayed when leaving would have been easier and nobody important was watching. I knew what that badge should have cost. I knew because I had paid that cost myself. And I knew Caleb had not. So I stood there with my club soda, watched my father beam beside him, and said nothing. Silence is not always uncertainty. Sometimes it is documentation waiting for the right room. I need to go back 8 years for the badge to make sense. At that point, I had already been an Army marksmanship instructor for 3 years. I was good on a range, but being good on a range is not the same thing as earning the credential Caleb had pinned to his chest under my father's string lights. That course was designed to remove assumptions. Not gently. It was a specialized selection program for a narrow operational role I will not name in full. The people who completed it carried a credential that meant something in rooms where people knew exactly what it took to earn. The attrition rate stayed above 60% most cycles, and the number did not come from drama. It came from bodies failing, judgment failing, preparation failing, and confidence discovering it had been built for easier weather. I applied the first time at 28. I made it to week 3. Then my right shoulder went. Not sore. Not stiff. Wrong. The kind of wrong where a man who has spent years learning the difference between discomfort and damage understands that pretending will not make tissue repair itself. I was pulled, examined, and medically reviewed by people who did not care about my pride. The injury was confirmed legitimate, which helped on paper and did absolutely nothing for the part of me that had to go home without finishing. I hated that failure. I still do. Not because it was unfair. Because it was incomplete. 8 months later, I came back. Same course. Same cold. Same ground. Same long hours where sleep became a rumor and the body started offering arguments the mind had to reject one by one. Nobody gave me anything. Not because I had been injured before. Not because I returned. Not because I wanted it badly enough. Wanting is common. Completion is not. I earned it from the frozen ground up. Every evaluated movement. Every range problem. Every hour in the dark when quitting became a reasonable suggestion, and I had to decide whether reason was the thing I came there to obey. That is what a credential means to me. Not pride. Not decoration. Proof. Proof that when the course asked the final question, I was still there to answer it. So when I saw Caleb wearing that badge like jewelry, polished clean and hungry for attention, I did not feel jealous. I felt insulted on behalf of everyone who had paid the real price. For years after I completed the course, I came back as an instructor. That is how those programs usually work. The people who evaluate you are people who have already been evaluated by the same ground, the same cold, the same math, the same hunger, the same quiet voice in the head that starts making quitting sound reasonable around hour 36. Candidates call me Shade. I did not give myself that name. Men who give themselves names like that usually deserve none of them. I heard it through the unofficial intelligence network that exists in every serious training environment. The whisper chain. The warning passed between candidates while they checked straps, cleaned weapons, or stared into the dark, trying not to look nervous. Watch for Shade. He's never where you think he is. If you're talking, assume he heard it. I never corrected them. Not because I enjoyed the myth. Because the myth had a useful effect. It made candidates understand that the course did not only evaluate what they performed when an instructor was standing in front of them with a clipboard. It evaluated what remained when they believed they were unseen. That was where people told the truth. In the dark. In drainage ditches. Behind berms. Between exercises, when exhaustion made men careless and the cold stripped away the version of themselves they had prepared for evaluation. I learned to move quietly because noise changes behavior. I learned to stay still because impatience reveals the observer before it reveals the subject. I learned that if you wait long enough, most people will eventually say the sentence they have been trying not to become. I was not there to frighten candidates. Fear is not useful by itself. Fear makes people perform fear. I wanted accuracy. I wanted to know who could remain disciplined when no one appeared to be watching, who could keep posture when the ground was wet, who could breathe through discomfort without turning discomfort into an excuse, who could still think when the body started bargaining. That was the job. Observe. Record. Evaluate. Move on. And because I was good at that job, I heard things candidates never intended me to hear. Including what my brother Caleb said at 3:07 in the morning, sitting in a drainage ditch 40 minutes before he quit. Caleb was 30. 6 years younger than me, and somehow older in every room my father cared about. That was how it had always worked. Caleb had been the son people understood quickly. Broad smile, good shoulders, state track medals in high school, baseball trophies on shelves, photos in uniform where he stood in the center with his chin up, and the easy confidence of a man who believed the camera had arrived because he deserved to be remembered. My father loved that kind of evidence. Not because he was shallow exactly. Because it was simple. A trophy could be held. A uniform could be photographed. A story about a difficult course could be repeated to strangers under string lights until pride felt like proof. Caleb fit the version of masculinity my father trusted. Visible, athletic, loud when necessary, charming when useful. The kind of man who could walk into a backyard, shake hands with people he had never met, and make them believe within 10 minutes that they had always liked him. I was different. Not better. Different. My work happened in places where phones were not out, where the important moments came cold, dark, and silent. There were no family photos of me doing my job, no trophy shelf, no easy dinner story that did not lose its meaning when translated for people who wanted the clean version. Caleb had real ability. I will say that because truth matters even when the person disappoints you. He was strong, coordinated, competitive. He could perform well when the task had clear rules, visible reward, and people watching. Those things are not nothing. But there is a difference between confidence and depth. There is a difference between looking like a man who can endure pressure and actually remaining intact when pressure stops caring how you look. Caleb had gone most of his life being praised before the examination got difficult enough to tell him the truth. And my father had mistaken that praise for proof. Caleb applied for the course the first time when he was 27. I did not know until I saw his name on the roster. Pierce, Caleb R. For a few seconds, I just looked at it. Not because I was surprised he had applied. Caleb had been circling that credential for years in conversation. The way men circle something they want other people to believe is already inevitable. What surprised me was the feeling in my chest. Not pride. Not irritation. Something closer to caution. Because I knew immediately what the family would do with either outcome. If Caleb passed, someone would say I helped him. If Caleb failed, someone would say I buried him. Families that have already decided your role do not need evidence before assigning motive. They only need an event large enough to hang the old story on. So before the first assessment cycle began, I walked into Major Daniel Harlow's office and disclosed the conflict. Harlow had been in long enough to respect paperwork more than emotion, which made him useful in exactly that moment. My brother is on the roster, I said. I should not be his sole evaluator on anything that affects final standing. He looked up from the candidate packet. You asking to be removed? No, I said. I'm asking for a second evaluator on every assessment where I'm primary. Written notes, dual signatures, no informal calls. Harlow studied me for a moment. He was good at that. Not dramatic, not suspicious, just reading the shape of the problem. You think he'll accuse you? I think someone will. And if he performs well? then I want that protected too. That mattered to me. I did not want Caleb to fail. I did not want him to pass because of me either. I wanted the course to tell the truth. That is what good assessment does. It removes affection, resentment, family history, old jealousy, parental blindness, and everyone's preferred version of themselves. Then it asks the body, the mind, and the record what actually happened. Harlow approved the management plan. Every evaluation involving Caleb would have a second evaluator. Every note would be time-stamped. Every decision would be documented. I left his office with the strange relief of a man who had done the only fair thing available before fairness became difficult. Then the course began. Caleb made it to week 2. That was not nothing. I want to be honest about that because easy lies make weak stories, and Caleb was not incompetent. He was fit. He could move. He could shoot well enough under normal range conditions. He had the kind of confidence that carried him through the first layer of assessment, because the first layer still looks like the version of difficulty ambitious men imagine when they are trying to impress themselves. Then came the stalking exercise. Final phase of that week. Cold ground. Low visibility. Limited sleep. Long movement through terrain designed to make the body negotiate against the assignment. Candidates had to maintain position, manage breathing, stay concealed, and continue thinking while the environment slowly dismantled comfort. That was where Caleb started coming apart. At 3:07 in the morning, I found him in a drainage ditch. He was supposed to be low. Still. Controlled. He was not. He was sitting upright with his back against the slope, knees drawn in, arms wrapped around himself like he was trying to hold his body together by force. His rifle was beside him instead of integrated into his position. His breathing was wrong. Too high. Too fast. The kind of breathing that tells you a man is no longer managing the moment. The moment is managing him. I was 40 feet away in the dark. He did not know I was there. That was when he said it. My hands are too numb. I wrote the time in my field notes. I can't breathe. I noted the posture breach. I just want to go back to my hotel. He said it softly. Not theatrically. That made it worse. The most honest sentences are rarely loud. I stayed still for another minute, long enough to confirm he was no longer attempting to recover the position. Then I moved on, completed the observation cycle, and entered the documentation exactly as it happened. 40 minutes later, Caleb officially withdrew from the course. No one had to humiliate him. The course had asked its question. He had answered. Caleb applied again at 29. Different cycle. Different lead evaluator. Different weather, different candidates, different assessment team. That part matters because people love to build theories around one failure when the truth embarrasses them. Bad luck, bad timing, bad instructor, family bias, a course that did not see the real man underneath the rough week. The second attempt removed me from the center of the story. I was not his lead evaluator. I was not the deciding voice. I was not the reason he stopped. And he still did not complete week 3. The documentation was clean. Final determination, failure to complete required course standards. No credential awarded. No badge authorized. No gray area. So when I saw that polished metal on Caleb's chest at his engagement party, catching light like it belonged there, I knew exactly what I was looking at. Not misunderstanding. Not family exaggeration. Fraud. By the time I arrived at my father's engagement party, Caleb had already been there for an hour. I knew because my father mentioned it before he said hello properly. Caleb's been helping me with the range setup, he said, giving my shoulder the kind of quick pat men use when they want contact to count as affection without spending much on it. Glad you made it. That was it. 3 words and a pat. Then his eyes moved past me. They always did. I had watched him greet Caleb from the driveway before I even got out of my rental car. Full arms. Big laugh. Both hands on Caleb's shoulders afterward, holding him at a distance so he could look him over like a man admiring work he believed he had made. People noticed. They always noticed. They only pretended not to. This was the pattern of our family, and patterns become invisible to the people who benefit from them. Caleb entered rooms like the room had been waiting for him. My father made sure everyone understood why. Track medals. Baseball trophies. Uniform photos. Stories with clean edges. Stories a proud father could tell without explaining anything complicated. I entered rooms differently. Quietly. Useful if needed. Easy to overlook if not. My work did not translate into backyard pride. There were no highlight reels of night movement, no framed photos of cold assessment lanes, no dinner table version of evaluating men when exhaustion had stripped them down to the truth. So my father did what he had always done. He loved what he could recognize. And because Caleb was recognizable, he became evidence. I became background. That night, under the string lights, Caleb stood with a badge he had not earned, and my father stood beside him like a witness to greatness. I stood near the drink table with club soda in my hand and watched a familiar thing become dangerous. Being ignored hurts. Being ignored while someone else lies with your history is something else. The first real insult came near the drink table. Not from my father. That would have been too direct for him. It came from Caleb, delivered with a smile in front of people whose names I had only learned 10 minutes earlier. A woman from Alyssa's side of the family stood beside me with a paper plate in one hand and the sincere warmth of someone who made conversation because she actually cared about the answer. "So, Nate," she said, "what do you do?" A reasonable question. At a normal party, it would have been nothing. Before I could answer, Caleb appeared at my elbow with the timing of a man who had been watching the room for moments he could control. "Oh, Nate's in one of those support roles," he said. He laughed lightly. Not cruel enough for a stranger to object. Just condescending enough for me to recognize the blade. Supply stuff, paperwork, inventory, making sure the real operators have what they need. The woman smiled politely, already unsure whether she had stepped into family humor or something sharper. Caleb looked at me. Must be pretty boring compared to the field side. I thought about 3:07 in the morning. The drainage ditch. His rifle lying beside him instead of integrated into his position. The words he said when he believed the dark belonged only to him. My hands are too numb. I can't breathe. I just want to go back to my hotel. Then I looked at the badge on his chest. Still catching light. Still clean. Still pretending. I took a sip of club soda. "It has its moments," I said. Caleb smiled like he had won something. People who perform competence often mistake silence for surrender. Dinner was served outside. Long folding tables under the string lights. White paper plates that bent under brisket, corn, beans, and the kind of catered side dishes my father pretended he had made himself until Alyssa corrected him twice, and he finally stopped. I sat near the middle of the table, across from one of Alyssa's cousins and 2 seats down from Uncle Grant. Grant Moreno was retired Marine. You could tell before anyone said it. Not because he announced it. Men like that usually do not. You could tell by the way he sat, the way he listened, The way his questions came clean and waited for a complete answer instead of rescuing the other person from silence. He looked at Caleb's badge during a pause in conversation. Then he looked at Caleb. "That's a serious credential," Grant said. "What was the hardest part?" Caleb lit up. Not smiled. Lit up. The way he always did when a room handed him the exact kind of attention he believed he deserved. "Stalking phase," he said immediately. "No question." That was when I put my fork down. Not loudly. Just enough to stop needing food in my hand. Caleb leaned back slightly and gave the table the story. Freezing conditions. Low visibility. Impossible terrain. Sleep deprivation. Moving through the dark while instructors tried to break candidates mentally and physically. He got enough details right to sound credible to people who had never been there. That was the dangerous part about half-truths. They carry just enough real weight to help the lie stand upright. Then he mentioned shade. I looked at my plate. "He was this instructor everybody warned us about," Caleb said. "Nobody knew where he'd show up. Guys called him Shade because he basically lived in the dark." A few people laughed. Caleb smiled. "He caught people slipping constantly, but he never caught me. At the end, he told me I had one of the strongest natural instincts he'd ever seen." I kept my face still. That is not easy when someone is lying about you 6 feet away. But stillness is a skill. I had spent years learning it in harder rooms than this one. What I actually told Caleb during his mid-cycle feedback was that his physical conditioning was strong, but his patience under observation was weaker than his scores suggested it should be. I told him he rushed concealment. I told him he trusted confidence when he should have trusted process. That is a long way from calling a man naturally gifted. Caleb kept talking. He described the drainage ditch as if it had been the scene of his endurance instead of his collapse. He described cold like something he had conquered instead of something he had surrendered to. He described shade as if the instructor had become part of his legend. I took a drink of water. Across the table, Uncle Grant was watching him carefully now. Not impressed. Interested. There is a difference. Uncle Grant waited until Caleb finished the story. That told me something. Men with real experience do not usually interrupt a lie right away. They let it walk farther than it should, because the farther it walks, the more of its own weight it has to carry. Grant wiped his mouth with a napkin and said, "What were you using for wind calls at extended range?" Caleb blinked once. Not dramatically. Just enough. "The usual," he said. "Mostly feel. You learn to trust instinct." Grant nodded like that answer had been placed on a shelf for later examination. Alyssa looked between them, still smiling but less comfortably now. Grant continued. "And for mill adjustments when density shifted between dawn and mid-morning?" Caleb took a drink. "That stuff becomes automatic," he said. "After a while the bullet sort of compensates if you know what you're doing." The bullet does not sort of compensate. The bullet has no loyalty. It does not respect confidence, family reputation, engagement parties, clean badges, or the fact that a man has found a story people like hearing. It obeys physics. Ballistic coefficient. Muzzle velocity. Air density. Gravity. Temperature. Wind. At extreme range, even the Earth turning can become relevant if the distance and conditions require it. Instinct is not a replacement for calculation. Instinct is calculation that has been practiced until the body can access it under pressure. I watched Grant hear the same thing I heard. Not ignorance. Worse. A man trying to make ignorance sound classified. My father did not notice. He was still smiling because Caleb was still speaking in the shape of expertise, and my father had always been more comfortable with shape than substance. But Grant's expression changed. Alyssa's did too. Caleb sensed it. His smile tightened. The room had begun to notice a gap. And Caleb, like he always did when a room stopped cooperating with his version of himself, looked for someone smaller to push down. Caleb turned toward me. That was predictable. When a man's story starts losing air, he looks for something else to puncture. "You're quiet tonight," he said. I looked up from my plate. "I'm listening." A few people laughed softly, not because anything was funny, but because the room had started needing permission to breathe. Caleb smiled. There was effort in it now. "You always listen, don't you?" "Usually." My father shifted in his chair. He did not like tension unless he understood which side of it he was supposed to reward. Caleb leaned back and gestured toward the dark shape beyond the patio lights, where my father's private range cut into the property past the cottonwoods. Dad had spent an embarrassing amount of money on it over the years. Steel targets, berms, distance markers, a 1,000-yard target at the far end that he mentioned at least twice every family gathering, usually while explaining that nobody had touched it yet. "Why don't we settle this?" Caleb said. Alyssa looked at him. "Caleb." He ignored her. His eyes stayed on me. "Dad's got the range set up. You can show everybody what all that support work taught you." The table went still. Not silent yet. Still. That little pause before people decide whether cruelty is entertainment. Caleb's smile sharpened. "Or are you only good at counting rounds in storage?" My father laughed. Quick. Too quick. The kind of laugh a man gives when he wants to stay loyal to the favorite son before he has time to ask whether loyalty has just made him small. I noticed he did not look at me. That mattered more than the laugh. Uncle Grant did look at me. So did Alyssa. So did half the table. I set my fork down. Wiped my hands with a napkin. Then I stood. Caleb's smile flickered. "Just once." "All right," I said. Caleb shot first. Of course he did. Men like Caleb always want the opening frame when they believe the ending has already been arranged in their favor. My father led us downrange like a tour guide, showing wealthy guests a wine cellar. He explained the setup to Alyssa's family as we walked. Steel targets, distance markers, custom berms, wind flags, spotting scope, the 1,000-yard plate at the far end, which he mentioned with the reverence of a man discussing a family legend he had personally installed with a credit card. Caleb chose the custom rifle. Beautiful piece of equipment. Expensive glass. Perfectly tuned. The kind of rifle that had been made as forgiving as precision equipment can be made for a man who wants the performance of expertise without the patience of earning it. He settled in behind it with enough competence to impress people who did not know what they were seeing. I will give him that. He was not a clown. He could shoot. At 300 yards, he rang steel. At 400, another clean hit. At 500, he took an extra breath, adjusted, and hit again. The crowd reacted exactly the way he needed them to. Applause. Phones lifted. My father laughed with relief, loud enough to make the moment feel settled before anyone had agreed it was. Caleb stood and rolled one shoulder like he had just done something casual. Then he gave a small bow. Just enough to be charming. Just enough to be smug. The badge caught the light again when he turned. He looked at me with that familiar expression. The one men get when adequacy has mistaken itself for proof. Caleb held the custom rifle out to me. I looked at it. Then I walked past him. Past the third. My father's smile changed as I moved down the line. Not disappeared. Changed. He thought I was committing to a bit. Some dry older brother routine where I would make a point about old tools and then miss badly enough for Caleb's story to recover its shape. People like my father were comfortable with symbols when they confirmed what he already believed. New rifle meant serious. Old rifle meant stubborn. Polished badge meant earned. Quiet son meant support role. I stopped at the end of the rack. Grandpa Pierce's old .308 sat there like an object that had stopped asking to be admired a long time ago. Walnut stock worn smooth near the grip. A few small scars along the barrel. No premium optics. No adjustable stock. A scope that had been mounted for at least 10 years and resorrowed so many times the screws had that faint resistant feel of equipment that remembered every hand that had tried to improve it. I had always liked tools that survived usefulness without needing to look new. My father laughed once. "You sure about that one?" "Yes." Caleb smiled behind me. Someone near the back muttered something about commitment. I checked the chamber. Worked the bolt. Felt the weight settle into my hands. It was not a perfect rifle. That was fine. Perfect equipment has its place. But perfect equipment can teach people the wrong lesson if they do not already know what they are doing. It can hide bad habits, smooth over weak fundamentals, make a man believe the machine is proof of the shooter. This rifle would not do that. It would give me what I gave it. Nothing more. Nothing less. I carried it to the firing position and lowered myself behind it in one clean movement. No theater. No rolling shoulders. No little look back at the crowd. Just ground, breath, rifle, distance, and the old familiar quiet that arrives when the body understands the work before the room understands what it is watching. The phones were still up. By the time I settled into position, the talking had stopped. The first target was 500 yards. Easy enough under clean conditions. These were not clean conditions. Evening air had started cooling over the property, but the ground still held heat from the day. That creates movement you have to read, not guess. The wind was light but uneven, sliding across the range in small arguments instead of one clean direction. I adjusted. Not dramatically. Not enough for the crowd to see. Just enough for the bullet to know. I breathed in. Let half of it out. Held the rest. Fired. The sound cracked across the property. Half a second later, the steel answered. Ping. The crowd made a small noise. Not applause yet. Recognition beginning before confidence. I worked the bolt. Second target. 800 yards. At that distance, people who do not understand shooting think the difference is only farther. It is not. Distance changes the conversation. Small errors become visible. Weak fundamentals start telling on themselves. The rifle does not care what anyone at dinner believed about you. I watched the mirage. Read the flags. Felt the old .308 settle into my shoulder like an argument I had already won years ago. Fired. Another pause. Another ping. This time, nobody made a sound. I heard someone lower a phone. That was when I knew the room had changed. The third target was the 1,000-yard plate. My father's target. The one he mentioned at every family gathering. The one he had never hit. The one Caleb had carefully avoided. I could feel my father behind me now, not moving, not laughing, not explaining the range to anyone, just standing there while something he thought he understood began taking a different shape in front of him. I made the final adjustment. Small. Patient. Math turned into muscle. Then I fired. The wait was long enough for the whole backyard to hold its breath. Ping. The sound came back clean. No one clapped. No one spoke. The badge on Caleb's chest was still catching the string lights. But now everyone had seen what did not need to shine. Caleb went pale first. Then red. Then he did what Caleb had always done when reality put a hand on his shoulder and asked him to turn around. He performed confidence. "You got lucky," he said. No one answered. That was the first sign the room had stopped protecting him. He laughed once, but it came out thin. "Seriously," he said, looking around like he could still recruit the crowd if he moved fast enough. "Old rifle, 1 shot at 1,000? That's luck." "3 shots," Uncle Grant said quietly. Caleb's jaw tightened. My father did not laugh this time. That mattered. Caleb looked at me, then at the rifle, then back at the faces around him. The badge on his chest rose and fell with his breathing. He reached up and touched it, thumb brushing the polished edge like he needed to remind himself it was still there. "You still don't know what it takes to earn this," he said. There it was. The mistake. Not the lie. The invitation. I set Grandpa's rifle back on the rack. Then I walked toward my brother. The crowd moved aside without anyone telling them to. That happens sometimes when a room realizes the center of the evening has changed and the body understands before the mind does. Caleb stayed where he was. His hand was still on the badge. That polished, weightless thing catching light it had not paid for. I stopped close enough that I did not need to raise my voice. That mattered. If I had shouted, he could have made the volume the issue. He could have turned it into anger, jealousy, an older brother trying to ruin his night because he could not stand seeing the golden sun admired. So I spoke quietly. The way I had spoken to candidates in the dark when the record mattered more than the performance. "My hands are too numb." Caleb's face changed. Not all at once. First the eyes. Then the mouth. Then the color under his skin. "I can't breathe." His hand dropped from the badge. Alyssa looked at him. Uncle Grant looked at me. My father stopped moving completely. Caleb knew the words. Of course he did. A man does not forget the sentence he says when the version of himself he believes in finally breaks under pressure. "I just want to go back to my hotel." I finished the line and let it sit between us. No accusation. No explanation. Just his own voice returned to him 8 years late. He stared at me like I had reached into a locked room and pulled out something he had hidden from himself first, then everyone else. "You weren't there," he said. It came out barely audible. I held his eyes. "That was the point of shade," I said. The room went still enough that I could hear the string lights humming overhead. Caleb looked at the badge again. For the first time all night, he did not look proud of it. I reached into the inside pocket of my jacket. Caleb saw the movement and looked at my hand like he already knew there was nothing good coming from it. He was right. I had not brought the paperwork because I expected to use it. That is important. I did not come to my brother's engagement party intending to expose him in front of 2 families, a retired Marine uncle, my father, and a backyard full of phones. I brought it because years of military work had taught me a simple rule. If the truth may be challenged, bring the record. I unfolded the papers once. Then again. Official course documentation. Final determination reports. 2 cycles. 2 outcomes. Failure to complete required standards. No credential awarded. No badge authorized. I handed the pages to Caleb. He did not take them at first. For 1 second, his face tried to stay angry because anger was familiar ground. Then his eyes dropped to the letterhead, the course identifier, the dates, the signatures, and anger lost its footing. He took the papers. His hands were not entirely steady. Alyssa moved closer but did not touch him. Uncle Grant stepped just enough to see without crowding. My father was behind Caleb now, looking over his son's shoulder with the expression of a man realizing pride can be misinformed if it never asks for proof. Caleb read the first page, then the second, then went back to the first, because the first reading had not produced a reality his mind wanted to accept. At the bottom of the report was the field that mattered. Evaluating Officer. Master Sergeant N. Pierce. Nathan Pierce. My name. Caleb looked from the paper to me, then back down. That was when he understood all of it. Not just that I knew he had failed. Not just that I had heard him quit in the dark. That the instructor he had turned into a story at dinner, the one he called Shade, the one he claimed had recognized his natural talent, had been standing beside him all night while he wore a badge built from a lie. I did not speak. There was no need. The paperwork did what family never had. It looked at Caleb without favoritism and recorded what actually happened. The room did not explode. That is what people imagine exposure looks like. Shouting. Gasps. Someone throwing a drink. Real exposure is usually quieter because the mind needs a few seconds to rearrange the furniture. Caleb stood under the string lights with the papers in his hands, and nobody rushed to save him. That was the first punishment. Not the paperwork. Not the badge. The absence of rescue. All night, the room had organized itself around his version of the story. His credential, his confidence, his easy smile, my father's pride, Alyssa's family trying to understand the man she planned to marry. Now every piece of that arrangement had to move. Phones were still up. Some had been recording since the range. Others came up slowly, almost guiltily, as people realized the conversation had crossed from family tension into something recordable. The badge caught the light again when Caleb shifted. But it looked different now. I do not mean physically. The metal was the same, polished, clean, bright. But once a lie is seen, the object that carried it loses weight. It becomes smaller without shrinking, cheaper without changing material. My father looked at the badge, then at me, then at the paper. For the first time all night, he did not look proud. He looked late. Alyssa took one step back from Caleb. Not dramatic. Not enough for most people to notice. I noticed. Uncle Grant folded his arms and said nothing, which somehow carried more judgment than any speech could have. Caleb lowered the papers. His mouth opened once. Closed. Opened again. No story came out. The room had finally stopped giving him one. Caleb was not stripped of the badge that night. I want to be precise about that because people love turning real consequences into cleaner stories than reality usually allows. No commanding officer appeared from behind the patio lights. No dramatic order was given in front of the engagement guests. No one ripped anything off his uniform while the crowd applauded. That is not how administrative processes work. What happened that night was quieter and more damaging because it could not be undone. Two families saw the documents. A retired Marine saw the documents. My father saw the documents. Alyssa saw the documents. And approximately half the backyard had phones up by then, recording Caleb standing under string lights with course failure records in his hands and a badge on his chest that the paperwork said he had no authority to wear. By the time I got back to my hotel, the first video was already online. By midnight, there were several. Different angles. Different captions. Different levels of understanding from people who knew enough military language to make the story sound larger than it was, and people who knew too little and made it sound smaller. I did not post anything. That mattered to me. I was not interested in letting social media become the court of record. Social media is fast, emotional, and usually too hungry to be accurate for long. It can expose a fire, but it is a terrible place to investigate the wiring. So I did what I knew how to do. I wrote a statement. Clean timeline. Engagement party. Badge observed. Prior course records. 2 failed cycles. Public claim inconsistent with official documentation. I attached copies of what I was authorized to provide and sent everything through the appropriate administrative channel before the videos had time to become the only version anyone saw. Caleb had made the lie public. The internet made it louder. But the record was where it had to land. That was the only part one cared about controlling. Captain Mara Klein called me 4 days after the engagement party. She did not sound surprised. That was the first thing I respected about her. People who have worked administrative review long enough rarely waste energy on surprise. Surprise is for people who still believe paperwork exists because everyone tells the truth. Klein had been in service 26 years and had processed enough uniform, credential, and qualification disputes to speak about fraud the way a mechanic speaks about engine noise. Specific. Unemotional. Already listening for what was broken. I have your statement, she said. I have the attached course records. I have video from the event. I need to verify chain and context. Understood. You were the reporting party and an evaluating officer during his first course attempt. Yes. You disclosed the family relationship at the time. Yes. To whom? Major Daniel Harlow. She paused just long enough to write. Good. That one word told me she understood the entire pressure point of the case. If I had not disclosed Caleb as my brother, Caleb could have turned the review into a story about hidden bias. If there had been no second evaluator, my documentation could have been framed as personal. If the records had been sloppy, the truth would have had to fight through fog. But the records were not sloppy. I had made sure of that years before I knew I would need them in my father's backyard. First Lieutenant Owen Briggs handled the credential fraud inquiry after Klein's initial review substantiated the issue. Briggs interviewed me once by phone and once formally. He asked clean questions. Dates, times, chain of custody, what I saw, what I heard, what Caleb claimed publicly, what records existed. I answered exactly. No decoration. Decoration gives people places to hide. From the official summary later shared with me as the reporting party, I learned Caleb changed his explanation more than once. First, he claimed the badge had been authorized for participation. It had not. Then he claimed someone had told him informally that his performance deserved recognition. He could not name that person. Then he said the dinner story had been exaggerated because he was under social pressure and did not want to embarrass Alyssa's family. Briggs wrote that down without commentary. That is one of the colder beauties of administrative language. It does not need to call a lie in order to preserve its shape. Major Harlow provided his statement within the week. He confirmed I had disclosed the conflict before Caleb's first cycle began. He confirmed the second evaluator requirement. He confirmed that the second evaluator's notes matched mine on every assessment that mattered. Physical ability, strong. Technical patience, inconsistent. Concealment discipline, below standard. Final determination, failure to complete. When Captain Klein called again, her voice was the same as before. Precise. Unmoved. The record is consistent, she said. I looked out my apartment window at the gray morning beyond the glass. For 8 years, Caleb had treated the dark like it had protected him. It had not. It had only been waiting for the paperwork to catch up. The formal finding came 8 weeks after the engagement party. Not quickly. Not dramatically. Correctly. Captain Klein sent the notification through official channels first, then called me because I was the reporting party and because, in her words, you should hear the outcome without waiting for rumor to translate it badly. The finding was direct. Caleb had worn and publicly claimed a credential he had not completed the required program to earn. His 2 course attempts were documented. Both ended in failure to complete required standards. No badge had been authorized. No exception had been granted. No informal recognition existed in any record that mattered. The language was administrative. Dry. Clean. Almost bloodless. But I had been in the military long enough to know that some of the most permanent consequences arrive in sentences with no emotion in them. Formal letter of reprimand in his permanent file. Mandatory removal of the badge from his uniform. Review of all credential claims he had made in official, semi-official, and public-facing contexts. Corrective briefing on uniform regulations and qualification representation. The criminal inquiry was closed without charges. Some people online were angry about that when they found out later. They wanted a bigger ending, a louder one, a punishment shaped more like the embarrassment they had watched on video. I did not. First Lieutenant Briggs determined the evidence supported administrative sanction rather than criminal prosecution, and I agreed with that assessment. The record mattered more than theater. Caleb had wanted a symbol. Now the symbol had been removed by the only system that could make the removal count. A badge can catch light in a backyard. A reprimand follows you into rooms where string lights do not. Alyssa asked Caleb about the video before it had been online for 12 hours. I know that because Uncle Grant told me later. Not in detail. Grant was not a gossip. He had the restraint of a man who understood that other people's relationships were not public property just because the public had seen the first fracture. But he told me enough. She asked direct questions, he said. Good. She deserved direct answers. Yes, I said. She did. What Caleb told her is between them. What she believed is also between them. But 3 weeks after the engagement party, Alyssa's family changed the engagement announcement online from June wedding planning to postponed. Not canceled. Postponed. That distinction mattered to some people. It did not matter much to me. I had no interest in becoming the author of their ending. Caleb had written enough of his own trouble without me holding the pen. My father called 5 weeks after the party. That was more surprising. We were not phone call people. Our relationship had always existed in practical fragments. Texts about arrival times, holiday logistics, the occasional article he sent about rifle optics with no message attached, as if shared interest could do the work conversation would not. When his name appeared on my phone, I let it ring twice. Then I answered. Dad. Nate. He sounded older than he had at the party. That is a strange thing to hear in a parent's voice. Not age. Recognition. I didn't know, he said. I looked out the window of my apartment at the late afternoon light moving across the floor. I know. I mean about the badge. I didn't know Caleb hadn't earned it. I know. Silence. Then he said the harder part. I didn't know what you did either. Not really. I did not answer right away. There are sentences a man waits 30 years to hear and still does not know what to do with when they finally arrive. You never asked, I said. Not angrily. Just accurately. The line stayed quiet. No, my father said after a while. I didn't. I let that sit. For once, I did not rescue him from the silence his own honesty had created. Some silences are not punishment. Some are the first empty space where truth might be able to stand. It has been 7 months since the engagement party. I am back on rotation now. Different cycle. Different candidates. Same cold. Same dark. Same drainage ditches at 3 o'clock in the morning where men discover whether the story they tell about themselves has enough weight to survive discomfort without an audience. The candidates this cycle are better than average. 2 of them have the quality I look for and still do not know how to name cleanly. It is not toughness exactly. Toughness is too loud a word for it. It is not confidence either. Confidence usually arrives overdressed and leaves early when the weather turns. The quality is quieter. It is the willingness to stay inside a moment that wants to end without demanding the moment become easier. You can see it in small things. A man who adjusts his breathing instead of cursing the cold. A candidate who corrects posture after failure without looking around to see who noticed. Someone who keeps thinking after the body has begun offering escape routes. That quality does not photograph well. It does not catch light under string lights. It does not make fathers proud at engagement parties unless fathers have learned how to recognize things that do not perform for them. Caleb, from what I hear through the thin and unavoidable family network, is in what my aunt called a period of professional recalibration. That phrase could mean a dozen things. Knowing Caleb, it probably means anger first, then embarrassment, then a long argument with the version of himself he had been selling to other people for years. I hope he wins that argument honestly. That may sound generous. It is not. It is practical. Caleb has real ability. He always did. Fraud did not come from having nothing. It came from believing what he actually had was not enough unless it was dressed as something larger. That is an expensive lie, not just professionally, personally. My father texted me last month. No greeting. Just a photo. The 1,000-yard target at his range. There was a fresh mark on the steel. Under it, he wrote, "Took me 37 tries." I looked at the photo for a long time. I thought about him standing under the string lights, proud of Caleb's badge because he understood shine better than cost. I thought about his voice on the phone saying, "I didn't know what you did." Not really. Then I typed back. That's a good number for the first time. 3 dots appeared. Disappeared. Appeared again. Finally, he sent a laughing emoji. My father had never sent me a laughing emoji in my life. I kept the photo. Not because everything was fixed. It was not. But because sometimes a man learning late is still learning. And after years of being unseen, I had learned not to throw away small evidence when it was finally real.